Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. In one of the first videos of the show, I mourned the loss of the original Mistweaver gameplay. I invite you to watch that video, but the long and short of it is that it was very unique and very satisfying, but that even as early as WoD, it faced significant changes that made it feel nothing like the original iteration that I much preferred. Now, in this video, I'm going to do something similar for Mage, since if you weren't aware, it faced some of its biggest changes ever in Midnight. This episode may get ranty. So class and specialization reworks have always been a contentious matter in WoW. Unless a spec is somehow universally reviled, making fundamental changes to how it works is going to be met with some backlash from those who enjoyed how it was already working. At the same time, however, many players may enjoy the rework and actually get into a spec that they previously would have ignored forever. I know Survival Hunter sort of fits this description. While some people absolutely love its Legion rework that turned it into a melee spec, most of the feedback I've heard, especially at the time, were longtime survival hunters bemoaning the loss of their ranged status. Look, nobody's saying that classes should never ever change. I mean, just imagine if we were still adhering to Vanilla's rotations. And sometimes, the way things are just isn't working. I would cite Holy Priest's chakra system from Miss of Pandaria as a needlessly clunky design element that forced you to stance swap between single target and group healing for at least 30 seconds at a time. Legion essentially dropped these for the Holy Word spells that recharged based on your use of their less important filler spells, and has largely maintained their design sense. It was a fantastic change that simply made the spec feel less constrained. Or we could look at how all three Death Knight specs could focus on either tanking or DPS, how that was a completely unsustainable nightmare to design around, and how they subsequently made Blood the designated tank spec, with Frost and Unholy as the DPS options. So occasionally, a shakeup is necessary. But I also think that Blizzard sometimes gets too enthralled with the idea of change for the sake of change. My philosophy on it is simple. If it ain't broke, don't rework it. And my method for how to determine if a spec is broken or not is simple. Does it A, have thematic identity, and B, have mechanical identity? And I feel that Frost did have both of these nailed down. For thematic identity, it obviously had, frosty magic. Snow, ice, everything in that vein, as well as the concept of shattering the ice, which did connect to part of its mechanical identity of shattering, though its even more prominent mechanical identity was that of procs, and reacting to those procs in a quick and frenetic pace. I've often described it as the most whack-a-mole / Dance Dance Revolution spec. A spec which I began playing in the Burning Crusade, which I mained as of Wrath of the Lich King, and which remained my main spec all the way up through Midnight. So I'm going to run through a mostly memory-fueled history of the spec's playstyle. I will certainly be making some mistakes in the process, but bear with me. Vanilla's Frost rotation was truly a marvel to behold. Generally, you would want to open with Frostbolt, then Frostbolt, 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 and repeat. If your mana started to get low, you'd want to use your mana gem, and if that was on cooldown, then use Evocation. Quite the juggling act, I know. Look, it's vanilla, what were you expecting? The Burning Crusade gave the spec its first bit of identity beyond make stuff move slow, with the introduction of Ice Lance, an instant cast spell that did low damage, but which did significantly more damage if it hit a target that was frozen in place. This was an incredibly useful ability in PvP, when questing alone, and to an extent, even in dungeons. But not super useful in raid environments since bosses couldn't be frozen. Still, the concept of wanting our target to be frozen for us to be fully effective was introduced here. My memories of the spec in Wrath of the Lich King and Cataclysm are hazier as I wasn't super active during these expansions, but I believe these were the most noteworthy changes. The implementation of Fingers of Frost, a proc we could trigger from our chill effects that would make our next two spells behave as if the target was frozen, stacking up to 2 times, eventually evolving to 2 charges that would specifically be consumed by Ice Lance. This was a game changer, as it meant Ice Lance was now a rotational ability even against bosses. We also learned Frostfire Bolt, a fun and visually magnificent spell that sort of mixed Frostbolt and Fireball. I've heard that this led to the emergence of an unofficial 4th spec that involved putting talents into both the Fire and Frost trees, since the spell could benefit from both. Accompanying this was the Brain Freeze talent that would give our chill effects a chance to make our next Fireball or Frostfire Bolt instant. So pretty much right off the bat in Wrath, Frost was working with 2 proc effects, one to make us want to cast Ice Lance, and another for Frostfire Bolt. This proc-based identity would remain core to the specialization for many, many, many years. And lastly of note was the Deep Freeze ability, which could be used on any frozen target to stun it for 5 seconds. A powerful ability, but kind of useless against bosses. Until patch 3.3 made it deal pretty massive damage to any target that was permanently immune to stun effects, and thus very useful for rotational damage. Mists of Pandaria saw some pretty significant changes. Deep Freeze had its damage component removed, and Frozen Orb was added. Though always remaining worthwhile in our single target rotation due to its damage and ability to generate Fingers of Frost, Orb is much more relevant to our AoE rotation, so that's about all I'm going to say about it. Particular to Mop, mages were presented with their talent row of bomb choices: Nether Tempest, Living Bomb, or Frost Bomb. Our Brain Freeze effect became tied to these talents, and thus our main use of Frostfire Bolt. Nether Tempest was an instant damage over time ability that would occasionally proc Brain Freeze. Like most dots, it was an ideal spell to throw on as many targets as possible. Living Bomb worked very similarly but was capped at 3 targets and would do an AoE explosion of damage when it expired or the target died. Frost Bomb was the most unique, having a cast time and applying a 4-second debuff to the target. When that timed out, it would do AoE damage and grant you Brain Freeze. I personally preferred Frost Bomb thanks to the simplicity and predictability, but there was some genuine choice here. Additionally, we had the presence of the row of maintenance spells, which each asked you to do something to maintain a damage buff. Most infamously, there was Rune of Power, a brand you would place on the ground, which would buff you as long as you were close enough to it. Many players hated this, and it would remain in some form for many years, but it was never mandatory, so I just never took it, and was happier for it. Incanter's Ward gave you a shield that you wanted to be burst by incoming damage, as that would give you the strongest buff. Probably nice against rot damage, but a bit situational otherwise. My personal favorite was Invocation, which simply removed Evocation's cooldown and made it so that a fully completed Evocation cast buffed you for 1 minute. I think 40 seconds originally. Definitely the easiest of the 3 to keep up, in my opinion, and it never really bothered me aside from making you chain cast it before pull, so it would be at the full duration. And lastly was Alter Time, which back then didn't just affect our health and position, but our buffs too. Like, all of them. This meant we could squeeze out 6 extra seconds of Bloodlust of Icy Veins, and to duplicate any procs. As a Frostbomb user, it was pretty easy for me to get a Brain Freeze to Snapshot, and ideally, I'd be able to get some Fingers of Frost procs too. Also of note, patch 5.4 saw our previous mastery replaced with Icicles, which would store a portion of our Frostbolt and Frostfire Bolt damage into projectiles that would fire them off when we Ice Lanced, or generated in excess of them. This was probably mostly done to reduce burst damage in PvP, but it did create a fun period where I could stack Mastery and have Icicles as the bulk of my damage profile. As I said, Mop saw some big changes, but ultimately the biggest infringement upon the proc-based identity we'd established was having to use one of 3 different options for bomb spells. The rest was far less intrusive. All in all, it was a very fun time to be Frost. Warlords of Draenor saw the removal of bombs as a mandatory presence in our rotation, and Alter Time losing its buff snapshot, sort of reverting the spec in many ways to its pre-Mop form. And honestly, it was pretty great, especially during Highmaul. I must admit that Blackrock Foundry was a bit of a dark time for the spec, and that comes down purely to tuning. For whatever reason, Frost was just doing garbage damage at heroic gear levels. Though, oddly enough, I was consistently top 1 to 3 damage on heroic Blackhand, if not on any other fight. It kind of speaks to how good the raid was that I remember it fondly, despite my piss poor damage. Out of desperation, I actually dabbled with fire just a bit, but thankfully I didn't have to wait too long before the next tier. Hellfire Citadel, through our tier set bonuses and our Archimon trinkets, saw one of the strangest eras in our rotational history. We were able to store up to 4 Fingers of Frost charges and 2 Brain Freezes, and our Water Elemental had access to Water Jet, which would generate Fingers of Frost if we cast Frostbolt during it, and it lasted 16 seconds on a 25-second cooldown. So we would want to make sure we finished the Water Jet window with 4 Fingers of Frost, but we could also get Fingers of Frost from normal procs, so we had to continually dump our procs while also watching our Brain Freeze procs until just a bit before the jet would end. It sounds a bit clunky, and it was certainly a lot to manage, but I didn't hate it either, even if I preferred not dealing with it. At any rate, on the whole, WoD was a great time for Frost Mage, that by and large honored the proc-based identity we had established. Legion placed a huge emphasis on spec identity, for every spec in the game. I remember reading the blog post which stated that there was always one spell that felt out of place for Frost. To me, they were obviously talking about Frozen Orb, but no, they meant Frostfire Bolt? Because someone thought it was insane that Magic Frost and Magic Fire could coexist. Anyway, Frostfire Bolt was removed, and I was super duper sad about it. In its place, we got Flurry, which would fire 3 smaller bolts that would each leave a debuff on your target, stacking up to 2. This meant that now, when you got a Brain Freeze proc, you would want to Frostbolt into Flurry so that the first stack would get consumed and not wasted. You would then consume the latter 2 with Ice Lance. It meant that Brain Freeze procs were asking you to go Frostbolt, Flurry, Ice Lance, Ice Lance. Notably, if you had any Fingers of Frost charges during this, they would get consumed regardless. So ideally, you would use up any Fingers of Frost charges you had before starting your Brain Freeze sequence. The spec was still pretty fun and definitely proc-oriented, though I did miss Frostfire Bolt both for its flavor and its simplicity. That being said, simply having 2 different procs that you dumped with different spells probably was poorer design than the more thought-provoking choices Flurry introduced. The other major change Legion brought were the new capstone talents. Comet Storm was fun, but not super noteworthy here. The other 2 options, though, were very interesting. Glacial Spike turned our previously passive icicles into fuel for a new hard-hitting spell. I personally hated it, and always have, but I have to admit, it looks cool and has a certain appeal to it. My preference was Thermal Void. Initially, this extended our Icy Veins by 2 seconds every time we casted a buffed Ice Lance. In combination with some artifact traits that reduced the cooldown to Icy Veins, there was a brief period around Nighthold when near 100% uptime on Icy Veins became a thing. It was a really fun minigame of sorts, and was again a great time to be playing Frost. Naturally, Thermal Void got nerfed to only extend Icy Veins by 1 second, but with a free 10 seconds to compensate. Not much really changed during Battle for Azeroth or Shadowlands. Most notable were probably the Covenant-based abilities. As a Venthyr, I rocked Mirrors of Torment, which were mildly interesting, but probably the most popular one was Shifting Power, which would endure for an additional 2 expansions. Dragonflight and the War Within complicated matters a bit due to the scrapping of mob talent trees in favor of, in my opinion, far worse and more convoluted talent trees. Most of our damaging abilities were also made to be able to benefit from the Flurry debuff, while not actually consuming any stacks of it. Glacial Spike also gained more prominence due to the talent tree layout and became foolish to avoid, which I was not a fan of. In fact, Yggdrasil's tier set bonuses depended on you taking it, which I absolutely hated. Thankfully, with the War Within, it fell back into being a genuine option. Notably, Frostfire Bolt finally made a return as part of the Frostfire hero spec, though it now serves as a replacement for Frostbolt, and just looks way less cool and less weighty than it used to. Anyway, while Dragonflight and the War Within were far from my favorite iterations of Frost, I still enjoyed the spec as a whole, and could happily muscle through any frustrations I did feel. Every spec has its ups and downs, after all, both in terms of throughput and smoothness. And then Midnight fell, and for some incomprehensible reason, they completely reworked Frost. And it truly boggles the mind why they felt the need to do this. Frost was already a massively popular specialization, probably the most popular mage spec when you control for Flavor of the Month respeccers. While we still have many of the same abilities and passives as before, most of them function very differently. The spec now revolves around a freezing debuff we place on our target that can build up to 20 stacks. Basically, Ice Lance consumes freezing, other spells generate it. Our talent choices affect how many stacks of freezing any of our given spells generate or consume, but in my experience, the growth and consumption of stacks feels pretty volatile. Fingers of Frost now simply lets us cast Ice Lance as if it were benefiting from freezing stacks without actually consuming them. Flurry is no longer based around that 4-spell sequence, and is now just a spell you want to use when you have free charges, ideally from a Brain Freeze proc. Funnily enough, it could functionally just be Frostfire Bolt again if that spell weren't serving another purpose. Oh, and though it doesn't really concern me, if you were a Glacial Spike enjoyer, well, Frostbolt just automatically upgrades to it periodically. There's no control there, so it's pretty much pointless. Oh, and just to make things a little bit worse than that even, Icy Veins was completely removed from the game, and now Ray of Frost serves as our major cooldown. The spec just feels bad to me. New Frost is simultaneously easy and distracting. It's hard to play poorly, but your eyes are also constantly glued to your freezing stat counter. While we still have procs, they don't do much of anything to change what we were already doing. Got a Fingers of Frost proc? Well, go ahead and Ice Lance, which you were probably going to do anyway. The procs are playing second fiddle to the freezing stacks, which are the new main mechanic. Your game plan generally doesn't change. Frost has essentially become a builder-spender spec and feels nothing like the Whack-A-Mole Dance Dance Revolution proc reactive spec that we had essentially from Wrath through the War Within. In stark contrast, Old Frost was simultaneously engaging while leaving your mind free to pay attention to other gameplay elements. It's truly magical how it was able to manage that. In sheer disgust of what the spec had become, I switched to Arcane for the first time pretty much ever and tried to make it work. But, as if I was allergic to success, Arcane and Fire both did garbage DPS in Midnight Season 1, with Frost being like top 3 specs. Was it sheer dumb luck? Was Blizz using good DPS to incentivize people to stick with this awful new gameplay? Who knows. Eventually, I relented and went back to Frost, and despite not having touched the spec since the first few days of pre-patch, my damage immediately went up like 21%. Even more once I got some practice in. But despite doing good damage again, I'm just not having fun like I used to. I know many people love New Frost, and despite my joking about it, I don't actually think they're wrong for that opinion, but I feel just as many miss the old Frost. And if you have to choose between the two, I think they should have respected those who were already attached to the spec. Even if we assume that New Frost is good, I must pose the question of why a rework was necessary. Frost was already a popular spec, with a long-established identity of being proc-based and reactive. Nobody was asking for a rework. Those who liked the new spec could have gotten that gameplay elsewhere, theoretically without displacing players who already had a space and who already had an identity. And the worst part is that unlike many other rougher times in the spec's history, I know New Frost isn't going away anytime soon. Blizz just doesn't rework a spec and then give up on it after a patch or even an expansion. At best, after a few expansions, they might switch it up again. But it'd be foolish to assume they'd bring back Old Frost instead of something else new. It's a hard pill for me to swallow, but the Frost I loved playing and mained for practically 2 decades is dead, and it's not ever coming back. I've honestly considered switching classes for next tier. I don't think I actually will, because again, New Frost is very easy to play. I've managed to acclimate a little bit, and ultimately I'm just very attached to my class and my character, but it just doesn't hit the same, you know? And that's just kind of sad. So in conclusion, for Frost, and probably countless other specs that have concerned me less, if it ain't broke, don't rework it. For this week's drawing, I obviously wanted to draw a Frost Mage. However, the only really prominent Frost Mage is Jaina, and I drew her about 2 years ago. The other two that sprung to mind were Meryl Feldstorm and Modera, neither of which are super prominent or are characters that I really care that much about. So then my mind started considering angry, pissed off mages, of which I had 3 options. Jaina, again, Aethys Sunreaver, or Egwene, Medivh's mommy and the previous guardian of Tirisfal. I decided to go with Egwene because I always kind of liked her design. She has very flowy robes, that very vanilla-esque cloth frill behind her head, and those hair ornaments, which I'm going to choose to believe are like magical arcane-y things, and not old lady hairpins that I've seen in some depictions of her. And hey, in that one comic, whose canonicity I'm not certain about, she was staying with Jaina on Theramore or something. So that sort of ties back to Frost. Oh, and I know she has much stronger ties to Atiesh, but I already drew that with Medivh, so I decided to go with Aluneth. And yeah, most of my knowledge of Egwene just comes from reading wiki articles about her. I believe originally she was depicted as sort of self-centered, thinking herself above the Council of Tirisfal just because she knows best. And I think over time that depiction has sort of changed to her being independent of the corruption of the Council of Tirisfal, and it falling victim to politics, which has softened her character a bit. I was fine with her either way. In fiction, narcissistic women are awesome, but you know, whatever. In-game, we pretty much just see her in Cathedral of Eternal Night and Tomb of Sargeras, where her echo sort of served as our guide, but it wasn't very interesting. Anyway, I drew her in Storm Peaks, so you know, snow. Frost, it works, right? And I did this because I could swear it used to be the case that she defeated the avatar of Sargeras in the Storm Peaks. But when I looked it up prior to making this video, apparently that happened in Dragonblight. I swear this had to have been retconned. Anyway, I already drew Dragonblight, so here's Storm Peaks. And like when I tried to do it with Khadgar, I'm not great at arcane circles and spell effects, so I hope it turned out okay-ish. Alright, that'll do it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you next week. Bye-bye!